Hello and welcome. Definition of language by Henry Sweet. According to Henry Sweet, language is the expression of, language is the explanation of, language is the beautification of, language is the clothing of, language is the coloring of what? Coloring of ideas by means of speech sounds, with the help of speech sounds, because the first need for human is to communicate through speech combined into words. And how we communicate? How we produce speech sounds? By combining words. Continue. Words are combined into sentences, and this combination answering to that of ideas into thoughts. So according to Henry Sweet, what we come to understand is that language is the expression of ideas with the help of which we speak by combining into words. And words are combining into sentences, and this combination translates our rambling ideas into thoughts. Continue. Review of lesson. Language is the expression of ideas by means of speech sounds combined into words. Words are combined into sentences. This combination answering to that of ideas into thoughts. Henry Sweet. This definition of language is very comprehensive. I recommend all of you to memorize this definition. Definition of language by Edward Sapir. Edward Sapir says, language is a purely human and non-instinctive methods communicating ideas, emotions and desires by means of a system of voluntarily produced symbols. In this definition, we have some important terms, and the most important one is purely human. Language is a purely human refers to the idea that language is the area of experience that belongs to the human race. Animals for that matter cannot speak language. They may have their own language to communicate with one another, but they are not the language that could generate ideas and that could invent things. Now let's move to the next point. Non-instinctive methods. Language is also a non-instinctive way of expression. There are two terms: instinctive way of expressing something and non-instinctive way of expressing something. Instinctive way is a natural way, like the way you walk. Sometimes you don't know how you walk. You open and close your eyes normally in a minute. You don't know how many times you do it. Scratching your head, you don't know when and how do you do it. There are some instinctive activities, spontaneous activities, natural activities that happen by nature, that happen spontaneously. Without yourself being conscious, you are doing those things. Language is not an instinctive way of expression. Language is non-instinctive. That is to say, you have to make deliberate attempt to express yourself. You are trained to learn the language. You are made to learn the language, to speak the language. That is the point here being referred to non-instinctive methods. Communicating ideas, emotions and desires. Of course, language helps us to express ideas, emotions and our desires. Without language, we as humans cannot exist in the society. By means of a system of voluntarily produced symbols. And how do we communicate ideas? By a system of voluntarily produced symbols. That is to say, we follow the system of a speech. We follow the system in which a spoken form is organized through various alphabetical vocal symbols. Here, voluntarily produced symbols refer to 44 sounds in English language. So, what we have come to know in this definition is that language is a purely human. It is a non-instinctive way of expression. Language helps us to communicate ideas, emotions and desires. And we communicate and express ourselves through a system of phonetic alphabets, phonetic symbols. In other words, we can refer them to organs of a speech. They help us to produce particular sound to express something. That is the idea. Now, let's have a review of definition. Language is a purely human and non-instinctive methods communicating ideas, emotions and desires by means of a system of voluntarily produced symbols. Definition of language by Bernard Bloch and George L. Trager. Bloch and Trager define a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which a social group cooperates. Here the first important term to understand this definition is arbitrary. What we call arbitrariness in linguistics is the central part of discussing language. And what is arbitrary? There is no connection between the word, sound and the name or object given to it. What is this? Look here, we have here the picture of book. The picture is one, but we call it book in English language. So what I mean to say is that in Arabic language, we call the same object, the same picture as kitab. In Hindi language, we call the same object as pustak. And in different languages, we have different words for the same object. So what we come to understand is that there is no scientific connection between the word book, pustak, kitab, and the object and the name given to it. If there is a scientific connection, if there is a logical connection, if there is a permanent connection, if there is a God-gifted connection between the object, between the picture and the word given to it, name given to it, it means that we cannot change it. The same object will be known by the same name everywhere in the world. But that is not so. What we call this arbitrariness. This is the arbitrary way of expressing or naming an object or a picture or a thing. Take another example. That's in the second picture you can see a sky. We call it in English a sky, S-K-Y. The object is the same, but the word in English is a sky. But in Arabic we call it falak. In Urdu we call it asman. In Hindi we call it akash. And in different languages we have the different names for the same object, for the same thing, for the same picture. So is there any logical connection between the object and the words given to it, or between the object and different sounds of words with which we speak and name them? Is there any logical connection? Is there any scientific connection? So this idea of an object being represented by many different words depending upon the society you belong to, culture you belong to, language you speak, this is known as arbitrariness. And this is very important to understand this definition. That is why they say a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols. Now, we have the next part, vocal symbols. What do you mean by vocal symbols? Vocal symbols, in fact, they refer to phonetic symbols. And you know, we have 44 phonetic symbols in our English language. Sometimes we also call them by another name, phonetic alphabets. And that's why we have IPA, what we call International Phonetic Alphabet. They represent sounds of the language. So a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which a social group cooperates. And when we say a social group cooperates, it means any group, small or big. You may have a group of friends, you may have a group of people in the society, you may have a group of people in the country. So what we mean to understand with this definition is that a language is a system of arbitrary vocal sounds, vocal symbols, and with the help of which a particular social group interacts, talks, speaks, and cooperates with each other in different areas of human experience. And this definition of language is really very comprehensive, very beautiful. I suggest you should memorize this definition by heart. Now let's go to the review of lesson. A language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols by means of which a social group cooperates. Bloch and Trager. Most common definitions of language. Language is a tool of communication. Of course, language is an instrument with the help of which we communicate, we speak, we talk to our friends, because the fundamental function of language is to communicate, is to speak, is to talk, is to interact. Go to the next point. Language is an expression of identity. Language is also your expression of cultural and social identity. It is the language that makes you feel you belong to this particular society. Language gives you your social and cultural prestige. Go to the next. Language is a representation of thought. Of course, if you don't have language, how can you represent your ideas? How can you represent your thoughts? How can you express them? How can you impress upon others? We continue our discussion. Language is an internal component of the brain. Of course, it is an internal component in the sense that language happens in the mind, in the brain, not outside. Of course, there is a difference between mind and brain. But it is an internal component, a God-gifted, well-built component in the brain of human being. And from there it functions and helps us speak or use the language in a way we want. Language is a meaning-making entity, means a meaning-making thing. Language is something that gives us an opportunity to express something meaningful. Language is something that helps us convey meaningful social exchanges in life. Next, language has a complex process with a system of elements and governed principles. Of course, language is not so easy. If we study deep into it, if you dive deep into it, you'll find that it has a complex process. It has layers and layers of levels, like you have phonetics, phonetic symbols, you have syntax, we have semantics, and we have so many other things. It has definite rules and regulations. It has too many elements inside it. And of course, it is governed by principles. It is governed by certain rules and regulations. So in that way, if you study how language works, how language functions, and how a child speaks language, it means that it is a complex process. It's not as easy as we speak. For a normal person, language is something like we started speaking our mother tongue. It is like we started walking and talking. So in that way, it appears to be very easy. But as a linguist or as a student of linguistics, if you try to study, you will come to know that it has a very complex process. And the last point in this direction is language is the faculty of articulating words. Refers to the idea that language has the power, language has the ability, language has the capability that helps us articulate our ideas with the help of words and sentences. So these are some of the most common definitions of language which we as learners normally understand, apart from what famous persons, famous thinkers have defined language. Hope you understand. Thank you and goodbye.